Okay, well, welcome everyone to our Thursday author series. My name is Julie and I'm the events manager here at Roundabout Books. So we are so excited to open our 2022 in-person events with Generation Occupy. This is our first live event of the year, so again, thank you everybody for being here in the store. I know that it's really difficult right now, and I understand the masks are terrible. Don't forget to check out our event calendar and sign up for our monthly newsletter to stay updated on everything happening at Roundabout Books, including the fact that we're taking over the suite across the hall in the next month or two. So we are going to expand and it's going to be great. So for example, we have a full schedule of events in February, including a virtual event with Lindsay Vaughn for her memoir Rise. So ask a bookseller after the event for more information about those upcoming things. So we are going to dive right in. I did want to show you guys, these were all of my notes, both personal and what I was going to talk about tonight. So this past September, New York Times journalist Todd Gitlin wrote this. 10 years ago this month, the story goes, a few dozen activists squatted into Potty Park near Wall Street. 3 years had passed since Barack Obama declared the audacity of hope. Now came the autumn of despair, fury and hand-painted placards. They set up tents and a kitchen and Wi-Fi for blogging and live streaming, and congregated for meetings wherein anyone could speak up and the crowd would repeat phrase by phrase what the speaker said. They called this the human mic, and to signal agreement, wiggled their fingers instead of applauding. So as you can see, I could ask you about 100 questions about this extensive and compelling analysis of Occupy Wall Street. But first, I want to talk about the language of Occupy. Can you remind us of some of the words and phrases we are still using that came from the Occupy movement?
Thank you. Thanks for, it's great to be here. Thanks to be crowdish.
Do we need to use the mic? Are you guys hearing us in the back? Okay, yeah.
Project our particles as far as they can.
Right, that's it.
Keep it moderate. The language, in thinking about how to construct the book, tell the story, it was really clear to me that I had to begin with the economy, since Occupy was fundamentally about economic justice. And I think that the language that stuck the most in our culture, that is undeniable, even to those who may know nothing about Occupy, it might have been just a little hint in their consciousness. They picked it up one moment, Occupy Wall Street, what is that? It's the 99%. And it was the language that Occupy invented, not from scratch, because people had talked about the majority, people had used different terms, but no one had ever broken down inequality and put an us, the big us, versus the tiny them, the 99 versus the 1%. And that sort of laid the stage for what Occupy's message, and many messages, were able to kind of, everything filtered out from that basic recreation of the language. It was all about a new narrative. I interviewed a lot of people for this book. Over 50 interviews went into it, and so many people really wanted to talk about the new narrative that Occupy created that just hadn't existed in our hyper-capitalist, neoliberal era, everything up through the last 30, 40 years, starting, in the Reagan years especially, but even in the 40s, 50s, 60s, in the post-war era, we just didn't use that type of populist economic language. And then of course the memes and the slogans stuck. Tax the rich became the marquee slogan of the decade that Bernie Sanders carried and all the way through till today. End corporate rule, people over profits, these short memes, which ironically it was like Trump developed the 3-word memes, right? Build a wall, lock her up, all those short, digestible phrases that really stuck with his people. But Occupy before that had kind of had infiltrated through its own 3-word memes. I have a number of them in the book, just that were written on people's signs and that were a really elemental way to break down the language to really understandable terms, and corporate rule, these various basic economic justice slogans. I actually need to look them up.
Yeah.
I'm rusty on the actual memes, but I think
a lot of us do know them, and I'm actually remembering that my uncle nicknamed all the birds in his yard the 99% because he was feeding them for free. I was like, okay, let's not do that. 2007 and 2008 when Obama was elected, and it's in Todd's quote, you know, the audacity of hope, and we had this hope and change. But one of the things that really struck me was seeing the through line of him bailing out the banks with TARP while millions of Americans lost their homes to foreclosure. So can you talk to us about the ways that 3 years later, what Obama said he would do and then didn't helped Occupy Wall Street?
Can I, it's only the briefest part, it's the first page and a half of the book where it starts to sort of get it started, and it speaks directly to that. Where did Occupy come from? Why did we emerge? And just as a note, man in the front of the audience, Joel, I met through our associations in Occupy. There's so many connections that out of that whirlwind of sort of that chaotic moment brought us all together in our various cities, in our hundreds of cities. But what was it that really brought us out? It is the Obama complex. But I'll just read the first page and a half because it's where the story begins and it sets that stage. In the first chapter, it's called Occupy a Generation. A decade after Occupy Wall Street ignited a discussion about wealth inequality, corporate greed, and the corrupting influence of money in politics, people still ask, what happened to Occupy? The movement that sprang to life in Lower Manhattan on September 17, 2011, the 224th anniversary of the signing of the U.S. Constitution, sparked occupations in 1,000 towns and cities that seemed for several months to rewire America's political DNA. Polls showed 2/3 of the country backed the ideas and principles of the movement, and for a brief autumn, Occupy captured the global stage as its message resonated around the world. Then, like a storm, it was over. It collapsed both from its own lack of structure and from the state violence that suppressed it. Occupy vanished almost as quickly as it had arrived. One thing most people remember is that Occupy introduced the vocabulary of the 99% and the 1%, putting the crisis of inequality on the map. But that's about it. The movement created no electoral organization, achieved no legislative success, and made no real impact on American political life, or so the storyline went. To date, no one has provided an accurate answer to the question, what happened to Occupy? I would contend we are no longer the country we were before Occupy Wall Street revived the labor movement, remade the Democratic Party, and reinvented activism, birthing a new culture of protest that put the fight for economic and social justice at the forefront of a generation. Far from a passing phenomenon, Occupy inaugurated an era of political change in which the demands of the majority continue to grow louder and more focused. It began with the kids. The kids came out and they didn't go home. They targeted Wall Street, the source of our dysfunctional democracy, and issued a singular demand that was all of the demands: justice, fairness, equality. Their slogan, "We are the 99%, inspired hundreds of thousands to move away from their screens and into the streets and squares where the vision of Occupy replaced the unfulfilled promise of Obama's hope and change. They had no leaders. There was no plan. This was not a protest. It was a rebellion, a revolt whose time had come. The seeds they planted took root overnight and quickly spread and multiplied, germinating in the country's consciousness. No one thought young people would remain camped out in parks forever, nor did anyone expect the movement to reshape the political and cultural arenas in the ways that it did. I didn't come to New York looking for a revolution. I came to catch a flight leaving JFK for Berlin, where I had a wife waiting to divorce me. I believe in the adage that when one door closes, another one opens. It may not be the one you expect, but the trick is to walk through it anyway. Perhaps I had been waiting for Occupy. We had all, to some degree, been waiting for it. And when it finally appeared, I felt I had no choice. It was right there in front of us, staring our generation in the eyes, daring us to act as no moment ever had, to put our convictions and our bodies on the line. We weren't used to doing such things, our generation. You could call us the Obama generation. The iPhone generation works too. We were the anti-globalization and the millennial generation, the unaffordable rent and college debt generation. We were also, of course, the September 11, Iraq War, financial crisis, and Great Recession generation. We were the occupied generation occupied. So that's sort of the premise to set out and
So,
tackle this.
right. I guess too, what I want to talk a little bit more too is about just, we're gonna see this with, I think, all presidents when you look back on a historical lens. There's just no way to tell when it's happening, what they're doing. But he really did, I'm a fan, he really did let the banks off. I mean, he just did. So, where, like, why? I know that's a really big question, but like, what were a lot of us who maybe weren't there not realizing that he was selling us out?
Right.
And he was.
I mean, yeah, Occupy was absolutely a reaction. If there was one thing that brought the people into the streets, it was the outrage, like the Tea Party that came the year before Occupy in 2010, the outrage to let the banks off the hook. They took down the global economy. They got away with how many hundreds of billions of dollars, how many of our homes and our pensions and our life savings were lost. Tens of millions of Americans, no bailout, big banks, bailouts. And it just, I think, Obama's doing that revealed what Occupy then came forward to say, which is that Washington isn't in control. It's Wall Street. It is the banks. They run the show. They pull the strings. They tell our leaders what to do. Obama, obviously, maybe inside, and I'm sure inside, he would have liked to have done more. He did not act courageously or boldly and didn't have the advisors to help him do it. And he did what a conventional, not the transformational president that we elected. And so, for a generation where this book kind of starts that had not learned activism. I mean, I was an environmental activist in the trees and Headwaters Forest in Northern California in my 20s, but really the first decade of the 20th century was like the Iraq War protest years. It was after the anti-globalization movement, and activism just waned, and young people didn't have an outlet, and they didn't even know how to get involved if they wanted to get involved. It wasn't, you could be in a fringe group, some socialist, this or that, or eco, or whatever. You're not going to move the needle doing that, and I think young people just didn't know how or even feel it in their bloodstream. And when this hit, it's like that message of we are in student debt, we have no health care, we can't pay our rent, and you just let the banks off, and my family's getting foreclosed on. That was it. And it sent us into the streets, and it was the reaction to all of that. And the first time that our generation could express itself and relearn kind of the muscles, regain the muscles of activism that now, this last decade, we've seen flexing to a much more degree.
Do you think too, I know you talk about this a lot in there because, you know, the Wi-Fi, the blogging, the memes, people just really taking it where we hadn't seen before. Because I remember during this time, 2007, 2008, I quit a full-time job and decided to go back to school full-time, and several people were like, you're insane. There is an economic crash happening, and I was like, I hadn't heard about that. I live with some roommates, and I need to go back to school. And then walked in 2010 to Portland and couldn't get a job. And so I feel like this also brought, because we can find out so much more, it feels like, on the internet now, that people are talking about stuff. So that kind of just leads me into, I want to talk a little bit about your personal experience at Occupy Wall Street and as the co-founding editor of the Occupy Wall Street Journal, which, by the way, is that still like archived somewhere online?
Oh, archived. It's in the Museum of Modern Art. I think it's archived in New York.
Oh,
for sure. Yes,
so like people can still go find it and read it?
It's an artifact. Yeah.
All right. But what are some of the lasting lessons that Occupy taught you specifically?
Gosh, lasting lessons. This idea of personal agency, of people who aren't anyone. None of us were anybody in particular. No one. This idea that regular people, all of us, when isolated in our rooms and on our screens, we really are powerless feeling. It's like you're sitting there watching the world crumble, and what are you going to do? You're just going to kind of, sigh and go on and pursue what you're doing with your life. But all of a sudden, I think what it taught was that in moments of great distress, which we're in right now, which is why I think a lot of us are waiting, where are the kids in the streets right now? I think it's coming, but it's surprising that it's taken this whole last year. I thought in 2021, when we weren't seeing movement on the political front, it's like when people finally do, and sometimes it's an event like the killing of George Floyd, like a moment that strikes and it ignites that spark. But I think that what I learned most is that a bunch of people getting together in a really organic, unplanned, creative, intelligent, inspired, collective way can move the world. And I think that people hadn't seen that. And the Arab Spring, can't even talk about Occupy without talking about that whole year of uprisings that Occupy was kind of the culmination of Tunisia, where it was just one man lighting himself on fire that lit off, set the Tunisian revolution and the Arab Spring, and the revolutions in Spain and Greece, where they had the indignados occupying cities across, and it showed that regular people without any political or economic or any name, you don't have to have gone to a special college or have parents that went to this or that or money. That was what it did. It just showed that we can actually do something. We failed to actually come up with the strategic, tactical plans to enable the movement to grow into something that would produce changes. But as I showed here, despite those flaws and failures of the movement, it still had these enormous reverberations. Just the fact that we showed that we could shake the system at its at its core.
Yeah. Well, I really like the way that you organized the book, kind of doing that, showing the things like that contribute to Occupy and then Occupy contribute to, and the kind of overlapping way that the chapters go. So, we've kind of already mentioned this. In the 10 years since Occupy ended, there are a lot of people that think, okay, well, nothing changed, right? Like, they did this thing, nobody cared, get on with your life. I think the entirety of your book is working to prove that wrong. But I wanted to focus on a few current political figures that you point out as direct results of Occupy Wall Street, which is Bernie Sanders and AOC, and her dress Tax the Rich. But there was an actual part that I wanted to read. So this is on page 90, when radio host Egberto Willies interviewed Ocasio-Cortez shortly after she announced her run for Congress. He recognized instantly that she was a political persona different from anybody else. I was so impressed with her. I could see that she had the it factor. For Willies, who had participated in Occupy Houston, Ocasio-Cortez's ability to go to the heart of issues of economic injustice in language incisive and inspiring marked a clear evolution in the years since Occupy. Wall Street first confronted corporate power. AOC isn't there without Occupy, and now AOC is doing it correctly. All the middle Democrats, they need to fear being primary because the country has already stated that it is a liberal country economically. Ask them about the policies they want: Medicare for all, pay it forward education, child care aid for parents. They're all over 60% support. They killed the physical Occupy movement, but they didn't kill what Occupy stood for, he said. Now Ocasio-Cortez stood in its place. I might have this one a little. Where, I can't remember hearing about Bernie Sanders before the last couple years, and he's been around for forever. So kind of speak to what maybe the people leaving Occupy and they saw these candidates and were like, let's do this. So yeah, talk a little bit about the candidates that have come from that.
Right, Bernie was wild hair, democratic socialist fringe, nothing in the Senate, a guy who had nice ideals, just like Dennis Kucinich, just like whatever, Paul Wellstone, any of your old progressive liberal, shout into the wilderness, do it all you want, nothing's gonna bend. But you've been doing that for decades, right? But all of a sudden, Occupy comes in and creates this new language and gives people a foundational knowledge and an understanding of thinking this 99% and the billionaires, corporate rule, taking on the billionaire class that seem untouchable, the Kochs, the Waltons, the dynastic families, the media moguls, and calling them out by name, putting a finger right on them in a way that we've never done because we're taught not to do that in this capitalist culture. You're supposed to embrace those who succeed, and okay, they're the millionaires or the billionaires, you too can do it if you just work hard enough, right? Don't condemn them for their wealth. That's like the American lesson. But finally we'd had enough of that, and for the first time since the FDR years, people went right to the top and called out capitalism itself, the actual system, put a name on it and said this system is broken. And once we'd done that, Bernie was fair game. All of a sudden he comes in and you got a generation and a whole country that's been hearing this message. But it was before Bernie, because 2011 was Occupy, Already the next year, 2012, Occupy fizzled, gone, disappeared. But what happened just months later? Obama gets in his re-election campaign, all about inequality. Transform the neoliberal austerity, belt tightening, we gotta get out of this recession by cutting things, by doing social spending cuts, the Paul Ryan, negotiating with Republicans, let's get rid of programs, out the window overnight, and inequality became the topic du jour. It was the discussion that all the mainstream economists were all jumping in. And Elizabeth Warren won her 2012 campaign and kicked out, and took over Kennedy's seat in Massachusetts on an Occupy theme of inequality and bailing out homeowners, not the banks, etc., taxing the rich. And you saw it wave, Bill de Blasio, the Tale of Two Cities, his whole campaign. Politicians grabbed quickly, and Obama won his re-election campaign thanks to his pounding on inequality, contrasted with Mitt Romney, the ultimate one percenter, worth $300 million, who make his gaffes about, corporations are people too, my friend, his quotes like that. So it just, the country was ready, but legislation was put forward, but nothing was really passing. Elizabeth Warren wasn't going to run for president for 2016, but the people I talked to, Charles Lynchner, I had a great, fortunate to get to talk to him. He became the kind of character who's the narrative, the vehicle of my politics chapter, because his story, he came out of Occupy, he was a more mature Occupy Wall Street guy, he was in his late 30s maybe then, or even early 40s, so definitely older than the rest. But a handful of these Occupy Wall Street organizers were wondering what to do. Everybody after Occupy dissolved, like, all right, we still want to change things, how do we do it? They stuck around, they were tech, very shrewd, very innovative tech developers, and it helped make Occupy Wall Street a viral phenomenon. And with their 60,000 person email list, it was this small band of Occupy Wall Street veterans who started People for Bernie. And Bernie didn't even want them in his campaign. Bernie ignored all their emails. They wrote saying, hey, we just built a viral global social movement for political change. We know how this works online. How about using some of our tools and tactics? No response from the Bernie crowd. They prepared nonetheless. They said, fine, we're gonna go do it ourselves, People for Bernie. And it's extraordinary because when Bernie launched his candidacy, he didn't have a website that was functioning. He didn't have house parties for the 99%, which is what People for Bernie developed. They had an infrastructure ready with thousands of people across the country, with Facebook groups, hundreds of them set up to welcome in, to like give people the keys to say, okay, occupy Tacoma, occupy whatever, Bend, any city, I'm sorry, not occupy, like Bernie campaign. What was it, People for Bernie? It was, what was it called? Bernie, every city had like a Bernie chapter. Feel the burn. They created it, and he never actually thanked them. And Lynchner told me, we never got hey, thanks for igniting my movement. Thanks for basically catapulting it into the stratosphere of the millennials and of everyone who was online. But they really did that. They got millions and millions of followers and people clued in. So not just in the language and the ideas that Occupy passed on, that Bernie grabbed hold of and ran with, but in the actual individuals from Occupy who played an instrumental role, launching his candidacy, and then leading on, of course, one of his proteges, AOC, who was in his Brooklyn, Bronx organizing office, who became then, the next face of the Democratic, progressive, anti-corporate generation. So it really, so many people I talked to say, we wouldn't have Bernie without Occupy, you wouldn't have AOC without Bernie. So Occupy had this really foundational role in transforming, but it doesn't get acknowledged so much. We look at Bernie kind of as though he just sort of emerged. He wouldn't have had that. People weren't ready for his message, I don't think, had Occupy changed the scene.
Maybe we could see like a Warren AOC or a Bernie AOC ticket, although he was a little bit old now, isn't he? Bernie's getting up there.
So much, we need the new folks to take the torch.
I do love Elizabeth Warren though. So there's a million things to cover in this book, but where does the legacy of Occupy go from here? What are some of the movements that you're keeping tabs on? I know in the book, you talk about Greta Thunberg, and you've got, students who are walking out of schools on Fridays for climate change, and I know that is gonna be, I've got a nephew who's 3.5, like, this has got to happen. But what other ones, like where, like you said, I feel like we are kind of in this little tipping point, like whether or not the protests that should have happened last year didn't because of COVID, but like I think they're still coming.
They're coming.
But what are you kind of expecting, or what are you hearing about it?
I would say, I mean, the George Floyd year, 2020, was a massive signal that this generation is here. It's not going away. It's only growing. 25 million. How many people do they think participated? More than any that, dwarfing any prior social movement in the country. So I think the racial justice part is crucial, and it's a point, I don't know if you want to talk about it later, but this idea of melding, because Occupy Wall Street really had let the racial justice component kind of fall by the wayside. It really didn't address it. Black, brown people, working people, a lot of people really didn't connect with Occupy because it was kind of seen as this anarchist, the college, white college kids in their 20s without room, going out to protest, living in the street. It wasn't a racial justice movement, but Black Lives Matter, I think, was a key. It was the next big social movement that came after Occupy, using so many of the same tactics, using the decentralized organizing model, city by city, reinforcing the movement, each city having its own kind of autonomy, but all of them kind of acting as a wave, pushing across the country against police violence. So Black Lives Matter, I absolutely connect as the next movement, but we got Standing Rock, indigenous leaders coming up. That was another stage of evolution of the movement. The climate movement itself is one I dedicate a whole chapter to, because I feel like what the next one is going to be, it better damn well be that one, I reckon. Along with economic. I think economic and climate save our lives, and then throw in save our democracy while you're at it. That's going to be the problem, I think, figuring out how, unlike Occupy, which had its surplus of demands and accusations and sort of what needs to be fixed, which were overwhelming to people, which is why people said, well, what do you really want? What do you're not going to get that. We're going to have to figure out how to narrow down the actual demands. Climate, though, there's such an evolution from Occupy right into the modern climate movement, which really didn't exist before Occupy radicalized this generation. People were marching, they were painting bike lanes, trying to get you to buy clean emitting cars, eat less meat, like the youth climate movement, 350.org. It was starting, but it was the Keystone XL fight that coincided the same summer as Occupy. And then I showed up in Washington, D.C. on the day when we surrounded the White House, 12,000 people linking arms. Occupy galvanized the nascent kind of climate movement, which then went off and running and got the anti-fracking movement that produced moratoriums across the country, blocking coal trains and everything up here in the Pacific Northwest. The movement really shifted the focus to the Northwest, to Seattle, to the kayaktivists, to the natural gas terminals, coal export terminals, pipelines across British Columbia, blocked one after another through legal and direct action style kind of combination. And then it led into, Standing Rock, and then really the climate strikes and the Sunrise Movement that improved on Occupy. And that's a big story I want to tell in this book, is that we made so many mistakes at Occupy. The flaws are evident. Everyone pointed them out for years, and anyone can say as many things as they want about how Occupy didn't get the job done. What the new generation and the climate people now did is they studied the flaws of Occupy, and they studied the color revolutions in Europe and the Martin Luther King civil rights movement and and the anti-Iraq war movement and these various and anti-globalization. And they did this real work with an organization called Momentum that was started by Occupy Wall Street veterans, trying to bring younger people, Gen Z people. Let's analyze what's worked in the past, what didn't work, what did Occupy get right, what didn't it? And they came out and started the Sunrise Movement, which then elevated the Green New Deal to the top of the Democratic discussion in 2019 ahead of the election, and made it a campaign issue that was front and center. That was the post-Occupy climate generation with AOC, and with they learn, and they're building, I think, and ready hopefully not to make the same mistakes that Occupy did.
Yeah.
Not just go freewheeling it, into a protest movement and an encampment, but actually strategize, plan what you want. And they're really doing that now. They're tactically, and I think that's the movement that now we will watch for. Like, they're just surrounding Biden's, or out there right now getting arrested, in fact, this week, right, out at Biden's home, demanding a more climate-centric policy. He's trying, he's up against, you know, a lot of wins, but they are kind of starting this direct action push.
So one of the things that I really appreciated is there's so many other books referenced in here that I think, you know, you can go and pick up and continue your education. But there's a lot of, like you're saying, the Sunrise Movement with Momentum, you know, groups that you could go and join. But one of the things that I really appreciated, and I hope that it doesn't like get anybody into trouble, but the section about buying student debt, people who buy it, and then this, I'm trying to remember the name of the group, but they're buying it on, you know, 25 cents on the dollar, 4 cents on the dollar.
Fraction.
But then they're fundraising and they're discharging people's student loans. I want you to know more about that, please.
Right, that's, yeah.
Me too.
I need some help.
Yeah.
But, and I know that that's not the answer. The answer is that students should not be having to pay $50,000 to get an education, to get a job. I mean, that, I know that. Is this still happening? Like, are they still, that is something I had never heard of, and it's like, I'm like, okay, who do I contact? Is there, like, what, that is so taking some, I mean, that is economic equality just in a snap. To take somebody's student debt and just be like, it's done.
They're trying to get Biden to, with a swipe of a pen, you know, eradicate whatever, the whole nation's student debt, or for however many million people, he's gonna probably do some moderate version of that. But yeah, all these I call them like the solutionary movements that came out of Occupy. There were so many, and I only addressed it in the last chapter to give kind of this extra kind of spirit of hope and optimism coming out of the book. Like, we're moving forward, these groups, the cooperative economics movement of co-ops, of worker-owned businesses that have flourished in the years since Occupy. Occupy lit kind of a flame. It was kind of a dead in the water, very stagnant, the co-op movement. All of a sudden after Occupy, people jumped in, because when Occupy ended, we had this whole generation that was desperate to really get something done in student debt, which a lot of people thought Occupy should have just focused almost, you know, on the banks and on that issue, because that was what affected that generation the most, right? But the debt collective, strike debt, which came out of Occupy, is definitely one of the big ones. Public banking, which is big here on the West Coast, in California, where really many cities are starting to, we have a Public Banking Act that the California legislature passed and Gavin Newsom signed into law. We are trying to get these really more progressive, like, platforms, you know, established, along with reforming the police and various solutions movements. But yeah, student debt is critical. I would think that would be a component of
That's
current movements for sure.
That's one of the ones where as I'm going through this, I'm like, can I help volunteer somehow? Like, that is one of the ones that, like, I was like, I want to, this is the one I kind of want to help start digging into, you know? I do feel like a lot of us would get that kind of paralyzation of there's so much to focus on, like, how do you get started?
Yeah.
But yeah, that was one where I was like, I'd love if me and my friends didn't have all this student debt. Yeah. Well, I do want to open it up for questions, because I think, you know, everybody here probably has a lot. So yeah, if anybody has some, let us know. You can feel free to kind of take your mask down just to be able to be heard better, but yeah.
Yeah. So I have a 14-year-old and an 11-year-old. I would say my 11-year-old says, I hate politics, but then she'll be out on the corner, you know, way more brave than I, to, like, with a banner and like fighting all the different movements, but she hates politics. And so there's this thing that has come out of the politics in the last few elections, that by our household somehow I've impacted her, that she hates that, but she likes the activism part. And for me, it's like, that's so confusing, because how can you hate? You've got to be involved and you've got to know what's going on to be active.
Right.
But I want to support them, and I think this book is an amazing book, and I think, wow, I want to give this to my 14-year-old, but it's maybe a little over the, you know. So is there any young movements that you're seeing, like, because they're out there, I mean, they're making posters, and you know, I get corrected all the time on Bear and he and she, and they're very clear on what's okay in their generation and very loud about it. And I want to support that because it's new to me, just coming from the 90s. Like, we definitely did not speak up like that, and I want to. Well, what can I do? What organizations would you recommend?
Organizations, maybe this for you
Or-
as a parent or for them?
Or have you seen any younger movements? I know this is more geared towards what's happened
I
and.
mean, I'd say the climate one's pretty darn
Okay,
good.
the climate.
The climate
Yeah.
strikes
Yeah.
and the Greta Thunberg's only
Yeah.
17 at this point. She
Right.
started at 50. I mean, those are the high schoolers who are walking out March for Our Lives,
Yeah,
gun
okay.
violence movement. That was all a bunch of 15 and 16-year-olds.
So maybe just like on social media, is like looking.
I think that they would find them on social media. I heard about a new one over the break holidays. Birds aren't real, or birds can't fly.
Yep.
Yeah.
Something like
I think
that.
Birds aren't real.
Birds aren't real.
Which I thought is really smart. They were making fun of the complete ignorant, anti-science idiocracy that we now have of people who just can't acknowledge anything. The climate is changing, the pandemic is killing us, and they're making a mockery of that by making a movement that looks like a social movement saying birds aren't real. Birds can't, which is, birds aren't real.
Birds aren't real.
And like a hashtag, but it really kind of got
Thank
them.
you.
And it makes people scratch their, it's like the new generation, what they've got, which Occupy had before, because it was so novel, so new, because it was the first time we had cell phones in our pockets and
Yeah.
could film it all and do it in real time. It was like just a real revolution for social movements.
Right.
But now they have to work with something like smarter and that kind of juxtaposes, that sort of hits us, because now we got the right wing movements. We need to somehow, we're not in the same space that we were, even in the time after I finished writing this and the afterward, like I finished in September of 2020.
Yeah.
So before the election, before the insurrection, before like our whole everything kind of seemed to take a whole different turn. Trump was bad enough, but we're in a new realm. And the new movements are going to have to respond in some way to that, which this movement seems to be doing. It's making a joke and saying, "You fools, look up. Can you see the birds like the new movie? Don't look up."
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like that sort of satire. And maybe the new generation is going to have to work on combining humor, not just getting angry, because the anger
Yeah.
and that only
It's
goes
there.
so far, right? Older people and people on the media, you can only go so far. Just sort of protesting needs to do something that helps change and get into people's psyches, maybe through humor.
Thank you.
So you mentioned before we started the event that you live up in Redmond, and so do I. So I'd
Yeah.
love to talk to you after
Okay.
this because I have a couple of groups I think she might be interested in.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
They are all over the place. Yeah, I wouldn't know where to start. Here.
Well, and that's just it too, kind of that, like, yeah, this is talking about a really big thing, but it did start pretty organically, or there are, it happened in every single city, or people just getting together, and, yeah, there's definitely groups out
Okay.
and about in both Bend and Redmond that are wanting to find more people that say, hey, the next time we do a march for, pro-choice, do you want to be there? Do you know
And
that?
And a big point that I make that a lot of people say is like, Occupy made protesting cool
Yeah.
again. Like, to borrow a Trump expression, like, it made it cool to be an activist, which it wasn't cool. It was not that cool, and many people told me, it's like when I was an activist in the 90s, the anti-globalization,
No.
2000 anti-Iraq war, this woman, Dana Belitsky, said, I go into a bar, tell someone I'm an activist, and the guy turns away and, leaves the bar. Like, it just wasn't that cool to be a protester. That was like from the 70s, 60s, 70s. And now that kids at 14 are leading the charge, it's cool. They're on Instagram, they're on TikTok doing it. So I think it's changed the culture.
Yeah.
They're the ones,
I'm actually finding it with some of my friends who are younger because of grad school that I'm not cool because I'm not going out and being
Right.
as much of an activist. We had the ICE detention stuff up in Portland and they wanted to put mattresses in front of the ICE building and I was like, I'm not there with you, sorry. Because that just wasn't, I just didn't feel comfortable and a lot of other reasons. And so of course there was, well, why not? And I'm like, I need to find my activism, And
Yeah.
so I feel like there is a little bit a shift right now too of like when people are like, what are you doing? And I'm like, I don't know, but I'm gonna find it.
The women's march was immensely important too.
Yeah.
And I think the abortion, you want to see people in the street, let's see what happens when the Supreme Court really does come down with a ruling. Like, let them try it. Let's see how our 200 million women or 170 million women in the country respond. Like, And that's the only
Those
thing we can
cats
kind
might
of.
come out again.
Yeah, let them try it, which is just like let them try to steal elections through legislatures overturning the vote. Let them try it, let's see, they think they have right-wing mobs that can go by 300 people in Arizona and surround an elections building. Try to overturn a democratic election really and see how the people respond. I mean, I think that we're not gonna take the stuff, the end of our democracy lying down, and people are gonna come out like
I
hell,
will
and
be there for
women.
that.
Mhm.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's just it. That is finally, that's the thing where if someone were to say, okay, you know, or when you go, okay, well, how many of us voted for this person, but somebody else won? And it's like, well, what's going on? And so, yeah, like, I'll be there.
Yeah, like this movement right now, the Women's March and Me Too, though that whole, the women taking the lead and making that inauguration of Trump, like setting that's it. We're getting our millions in the streets and it kind of fizzled and the next year wasn't the way it was the first year and it had its fighting, but yeah, I think that women, young people, everyone who sort of is due
They're
the
coming.
time, sure feels that way, yeah.
Do we have any other questions? I'd love to hear from someone who is also at Occupy. Have you read the book yet? Oh, are you going to? Okay. Well, it's so cool to meet somebody that's also was over there. I mean, it kind of feels like it was so far away, and you know, over in New York, and then, yeah. So.
So was that, I was in Florida.
Oh, okay. Yeah, very cool. So, yeah. Do we have anything from in the back, Aubrey, or anybody? No?
I just enjoyed listening to it.
Good, thank you. Well, of course, we have books for sale. We have his first book. Do you want to tell everybody just a little bit about the first one? So they know what
Just
it's
bring it
up
with
here?
me since it's the rare opportunity for reading. Yeah, this is my novel came out 2 years ago. Worked on it many more years before that. Based on Berlin, it's much more of a sort of story about different generation, not Occupy generation, but like male generation of today. It's sort of about where have this generation of males, men gone, in a kind of ironic and a European sort of an expat book based in Berlin where I used to live as a correspondent, journalist. So it's and a lot of history, a lot of gulags and Nazis and family past, and, all done in light humor and women disasters and various things. Yes, it's out of it's in the past. But I was going to say for the young, like, I wonder what Occupy even means since you both in the back are.
I honestly have no idea what Occupy meant for this past 40 minutes. But
Awesome.
it was like super intriguing. And, like, I mean, I'm taking AP Gov right now at Summit, and like I'm studying ASC the entire year. We all pick a representative or senator and study them, and ASC's one. So yeah, it's really interesting to just like listen to you talk about that.
Yeah. And for me, I think it provided, so I'm turning 24 this year, and so in '08, I was 10 years old. So I saw it, like, enough to know that something was going on, but obviously not old enough, like, watched, us lose our own home and, like, issues with money, like, I could see it all happening, but, I was 10, I couldn't process anything. And then, just as much as I learned about the recession through college, and so, because it's such a huge topic and everything that happened, it was really interesting to hear your question, just as a part of the generation that activism is so, like, I went to school in Philly, and so going out and marching was a once every couple months thing. Like, we just were like, oh, cool, we've got a new one, let's go down. And so, the whole, like, shift in activism was interesting to hear and kind of put the pieces together of just both my own knowledge and memories of the whole situation.
Well, what was interesting is you talk so much on climate, and like you said, you didn't know what Occupy meant, but like she just applied to all her colleges and wrote all her college essays on climate change and issues coming up, so it's like they're so aware. I think they're just using it as a different, they're not thinking in it in the context of an Occupy movement and thinking of it.
I was in Ireland for 4 months, and the whole campus was all about climate change, and because Ireland was passing a lot of bills about climate change while I was there, and so that whole time, which was really cool for me as an American citizen to watch how they were approaching climate change, and just how really putting the nail on the head on how much of a global situation this is in the global movement is really awesome.
Right, not be wiped out in history, in a sense. I mean, I wrote this so that I think Occupy will return. People will occupy. Women right now are occupying the courts down in Mexico. Women for abortion rights down there. They are literally invading and not leaving the courtrooms, and they're changing laws down there. Like Mexican women are the new occupying force. I mean, occupy is not a new concept, right? You go in and you occupy and make your demands, and you don't leave until they're sort of met. I think that'll return, but obviously, like the movement, we started something, but the next movement needs to have some longer range plans because we can't sleep out forever.
Right.
Do you have a mailing list that you're gonna tell you if there's another Occupy movement that you're going to, hey, you
Always.
saw me, come join me?
I would say like Momentum and Sunrise Movement was meant for a lot of their stuff.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
Sunrise is really of this. I think for your daughter, like this age, they're really organized and they're really everywhere, and they've got actions all the time. Extinction Rebellion is the other big climate one that kind of really grew out of Occupy too. A lot of the same people. Next
And you're
Gen-
on,
Hmm?
and you're
I mean,
following
I'm not. Sometimes I go to something in
Yeah.
San Francisco, like
Yeah.
an event of action. Yeah, Extinction Rebellion. But one point also I want to make is that even this great resignation that we're in right now, the worker, something we didn't talk about, but I have a whole chapter on the labor,
Wow.
Occupy labor.
Yeah.
crazy.
People don't connect that back to Occupy. Why would you, right? Because we're a decade later. But workers, since the 1980s, when Reagan gutted the unions, privatized,
Yeah.
cut pensions, cut contracts, made workers expendable, crushed strikes, organized labor had just been in real remission, and the rights of workers, and that I get to demand better pension, better health care, better conditions for my family, better job, consistency, hours consistency, all the things, wages, not to mention. After Occupy, and I was there in Foley Square in New York City the day that the unions came out, and they waited a couple weeks because they didn't want to be seen as supporting a movement that basically is calling for the overthrow, the government and of the system. They're like established unions. They couldn't be seen as so radical, but then 2 weeks in, they leaned in. They came out, 30,000 men, women, all their different colored t-shirts, all their different signs, flooded the squares. They made themselves the 99%. Like, yes, we are. And that didn't stop. And people don't recognize or refer back, but they ignited, Occupy ignited. It led right into the Fight for 15. That movement was generated out of Occupy in New York City, the Fight for a $15 wage, which spread like wildfire across the country. Everyone got it, everyone understood. It went around the world. Fast food chain strikes in Japan and England and Brazil and everywhere. The Walmart worker strikes, all the Black Friday strikes, which were immense. Thousands of Walmart stores every year. All of a sudden, 2012, 13, 14, Occupy people were helping organize that in huge coalitions. Because again, they were addressing the Walton family, the richest single family in America, with all, worth however many tens of billions, hundreds of billions. This 1% family, and they used that same tactic. So these strikes, and then the teacher strikes, the Red State Revolt in 2017, or 16, 17, when Red State women, again, working middle-class women, led in West Virginia and Kentucky and Oklahoma, like the reddest of the red states, and they demanded higher wages and they got them. And it just showed that, workers have awoken again. We're reconnecting. We have needs. No one else is looking out for us. We have to look out. And it ignited this. And I think that our great resignation, this whole people leaving the job, screw you. You're not going to even have us with masks, or my life is in jeopardy, my family, not to mention the wages or paltry. People are walking away by the millions. And I think it's incredible, and it's a sign of a real shift in terms of power. The executives do not have right now the power that the workers do in terms of mobilizing.
Yeah, and I know you talked a lot about the teachers, and I'm seeing it again because of COVID, because there's too many kids in the class. They're letting bus drivers be teachers because they just need a body in there. Chicago schools are about to shut down again because there's no teachers. And while it is probably still a lot to do with COVID, I can see that kind of where they're like, I'm not going to be, like, people on TikTok try to argue with me, that's the job they took, they have to deal with it. No, that's not how we're not doing that anymore. Like, that you don't just go, okay, well, you haven't had a raise for 10 years, but you have a job, so be happy. And that's where I'm kind of like, I can see that coming through again too, where people are like, how can just someone work for you for 10 years and be treated like this?
Right.
Yeah, I like it. But there's more.
There's more.
Yeah.
The whole burning, whole thing.
Yeah, well, I want to thank you so much for driving up, for coming and visiting our
Yes.
town, our store. Thank you everybody here for being here for Roundabout. We've had a great time even with the pandemic, so please always come and support your local bookstores. We have virtual events on Tuesdays and store events on Thursday next week. So on Tuesday, I just want to point it out because it kind of leads into this, we will be talking with the two authors of What's Up with White Women, Unpacking Sexism and Racism in the Fight for Racial Justice. So that will be online, so please join us for that because I'm very excited. I went to one of their workshops and I think it kind of leads into, white women are a big part of the country. What can we be doing better? So, thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
So